Far below the streets of modern London, in climate-controlled rooms where temperature and humidity never change, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets sit in silence. They are stored on metal shelves, labeled, numbered, and carefully catalogued. Most of them are never touched. There are simply too many texts and far too few specialists to read them all. These tablets are not decorative artifacts. They are records, legal decisions, economic accounts, ritual instructions, laments. And among them lie fragments of stories so old that even the people who wrote them believed they were remembering a distant past. In 2009, while reviewing old photographs from a collection of tablets excavated at Nineveh in the 19th century, a researcher noticed something unusual. One fragment, no larger than a human hand, contained only 11 readable lines. It was written in Akkadian during the 7th century BCE, but it was already describing events that were ancient in its own time. What caught attention was not the age of the clay, but the language carved into it. A single phrase stood out, one that appears nowhere else in the vast body of Mesopotamian literature. When the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki. This was not a war against monsters. Not a battle against chaos or darkness. It described conflict within the divine order itself. The fragment went on to speak briefly of weapons that burned without flame, of land rendered barren for years, and of a city where birds did not return for decades after fire fell from the sky. And then the tablet broke. Whatever followed was lost, perhaps forever, or perhaps still waiting unnoticed in another drawer. On its own, such a fragment might be dismissed as metaphor or poetic exaggeration. Ancient cultures often expressed natural disasters and political collapse in symbolic language. But this text does not stand alone. When scholars compare tablets from museums in London, Paris, Berlin, Philadelphia, and Baghdad, patterns begin to emerge. Across centuries and cities, different texts refer to divine factions, fractured councils, cities abandoned by their gods, and a catastrophic period around 2000 BCE that brought an end to Sumerian civilization as it had existed. These accounts are usually studied separately. Myths are read as myths. Historical texts are read as history. Laments are read as poetic grief. But what if these divisions are modern inventions? What if, taken together, these tablets form fragments of a single long memory? A memory of a conflict that escalated, spread, and finally shattered the world the Sumerians knew. Before moving further into that possibility, pause for a moment in the present. Wherever you are listening from, late at night or early in the morning, in a quiet room or a busy city, you are sharing this moment with others scattered across the world. This story unfolds slowly. It is not designed for quick answers or easy conclusions. It asks for patience because it descends into the oldest written records humanity possesses, and into questions those records never fully resolve. To understand why these texts matter, we must first understand who wrote them. Sumer arose in the harsh lowlands of southern Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq. The land was flat, hot, and prone to flooding. There was no stone for building, no forests for timber, and no local sources of metal. By most practical measures, it was an unlikely birthplace for civilization. And yet, around 4000 BCE, something extraordinary happened. Small farming villages expanded into towns. Towns became cities. Cities developed walls, temples, canals, administrative systems, and social hierarchies. By around 3200 BCE, the Sumerians had created writing, not merely simple symbols, but a full script capable of recording contracts, hymns, laws, and long narrative texts. Archaeology sees this as a rapid leap in complexity. The usual explanation points to agricultural surplus and specialization. But the Sumerians themselves told a different story. Again and again their texts say they were taught. They speak of beings called the Anunnaki, often translated as those who came down from heaven to earth. These were not vague spirits. In the Sumerian imagination they had bodies, families, rivalries, and responsibilities. They governed specific cities. Enki ruled the waters and the city of Eridu. Enlil commanded storms and agriculture from Nippur. Inanna presided over Uruk, embodying love, conflict, and the wandering star we call Venus. Every major city claimed a divine patron who did not merely receive worship there, but was said to live there. These cities were real. Archaeology has uncovered their remains. At Eridu, temple foundations stretched downward through layer after layer, showing uninterrupted religious activity for over 3,000 years. Beneath the theology lies a deeper structure. Chronology. The Sumerian king list, preserved in multiple copies, begins with a statement that still unsettles modern readers. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The first rulers are said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years. Scholars debate these numbers fiercely, suggesting symbolism or scribal tradition. Yet the text itself offers no explanation. It records these reigns in the same administrative tone used for later kings whose existence we can confirm archaeologically. Then comes a boundary. A flood sweeps over the land. Afterward, kingship descends again, this time to a different city. Lifespans shorten, but they are still far beyond anything biologically possible. The text does not comment. It simply continues. To the Sumerian scribes, there was no sharp line between myth and history. They recorded what had been handed down to them. And that habit of preservation, even when things did not make sense, is what allows us to read these tablets today and ask a question that still echoes through the clay. Were these stories inventions, or were they attempts to remember something older than memory itself? That question will guide everything that follows. To modern readers, the word God often suggests something abstract or distant, a symbolic force rather than an active participant in daily affairs. That assumption does not hold when reading Sumerian texts. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as timeless, perfect beings beyond change or disagreement. They argue. They scheme. They divide authority. They form councils. And crucially, they disagree about how the world should be run. At the very top of the hierarchy stands Anu, the Sky Father. He is distant, rarely intervening directly. Beneath him, real power rests with two half-brothers whose rivalry shapes much of the surviving literature. Enlil governs the air, storms, and agricultural order. Enki governs wisdom, craft, and the subterranean fresh waters that make life possible in the dry land of Sumer. Their domains overlap just enough to create constant tension. Below them stands a wide tier of other Anunnaki, each with defined territories and responsibilities. Ninurta, Enlil's warrior son, acts as an enforcer. Nana governs the moon and the city of Uar. Utu oversees justice and the sun. Ereshkigal rules the underworld, a realm as structured and lawful as the surface world, but governed by its own unbreakable rules. This is not a harmonious family. It is a political system. Politics, by its nature, creates strain. And the earliest major crisis described in these texts does not begin with humans at all. According to the Akkadian epic known as Atrahasis, the universe was already organized before humanity existed. The Anunnaki had divided heaven, earth, waters, and the underworld among themselves. The senior gods ruled. Beneath them were the Igigi, younger divine beings assigned the physical work that sustained civilization. Their tasks were brutally practical. They dug canals. They dredged riverbeds. They raised embankments to prevent floods. Anyone who has worked wet soil under a burning sun can recognize the reality behind the description. For 40 years, the text says, they endured it. Then they rebelled. At night, the Igigi gathered in secret. They burned their tools and marched on Enlil's residence. The word used is not petition or complaint. It is siege. Enlil, alarmed, summoned the High Council. Anu arrived. Enki arrived. The problem was unprecedented. Killing the Igigi would risk civil war among the gods. Letting them abandon their work would collapse the canal system on which the land depended. It was Enki who proposed a solution that would change everything. Create a new kind of worker. A being intelligent enough to follow instructions, strong enough to labor, but mortal enough to remain controllable. Humanity was authorized not as a moral experiment, but as a logistical one. The method of creation is described in language that unsettles even careful translators. Clay is mixed with the flesh and blood of a sacrificed god, the leader blamed for the revolt. The mother goddess shapes 14 figures, 7 male and 7 female. Birth goddesses attend. The descriptions read less like poetry and more like a ritual manual. However one interprets it, the meaning is clear. Humans are hybrids. Part earth, part divine essence. The solution works. Humans multiply. They take over the labor. The Igigi are freed. Order is restored. But only temporarily. Humans do what living beings always do. They grow. They spread. They build. They make noise. The texts are strikingly specific about the problem. The word used is not simply sound but constant activity. Fields work day and night. Workshops hammering. Temples chanting. Cities alive with motion. Enlil cannot sleep. What follows is not immediate annihilation. It is escalation. First plague. Then drought. Then famine. Each time, Enki quietly intervenes, teaching humans how to survive, how to appease the gods responsible, how to endure. Each intervention deepens the rift within the council. Enlil sees disorder. Enki sees responsibility toward a creation he helped author. Finally, Enlil proposes the flood. This is not framed as moral judgment. Humans are not described as wicked. There are simply too many. Too active. Too difficult to control. The council agrees. The decree is sealed. Even Enki is bound by it. He cannot openly defy the decision, but he can bend it. In the Sumerian version of the flood, Enki does not speak directly to the human king Ziusadra. Instead, he addresses a reed wall, knowing the king stands within earshot. He reveals the plan. He gives precise instructions. Build a vessel. Preserve life. Abandon possessions. Obey. The flood comes. Cities vanish beneath the water. When it recedes, sacrifices are offered. The gods gather, hungry. 4 days there have been no offerings. No bread. No beer. Enlil arrives and realizes someone has survived. He demands answers. The text does not describe violence. It describes an argument. Enki insists that total destruction was unnecessary. There were other ways to limit humanity. Predators. Disease. Infertility. Enlil relents, but the fracture remains. The gods have now faced rebellion from their own workers and defiance from within their highest ranks. The system holds, but it is no longer stable. Authority in this world depends on something tangible. An object known as the Tablet of Destinies. Inscribed, sealed, and transferable, it grants the right to declare what will be. Initially it rests with Enlil. But it does not stay there. Again and again later texts describe attempts to seize it. Anzu, a hybrid being, steals it during a moment of vulnerability. With the tablet gone, rituals fail. Commands lose force. Order collapses. Only through strategy, not brute strength, is it recovered. In another epic, the tablet is placed on the chest of Kingu, granting him authority during a divine uprising. When Marduk defeats him, the first act is to reclaim the tablet. The message is consistent. Authority is not innate. It can be taken. It can be moved. And when it moves, chaos follows. This instability at the highest level mirrors conflicts below. City borders shift, framed as divine disputes. Powers of civilization are stolen, bargained, and reassigned. Jurisdictions overlap. Boundaries are tested. One story exposes this tension more clearly than almost any other. Inanna's descent to the underworld. Without explanation, she decides to enter her sister Ereshkigal's realm. She arrives adorned with every symbol of power. At each of 7 gates, one piece is removed. By the time she reaches the throne, she is stripped of all authority. There she is judged. She is killed. Her body is hung on a hook. The gods of the surface refuse to intervene. To do so would violate underworld law. Only Enki acts, again indirectly. He sends small, almost invisible beings who exploit empathy rather than force. Inanna returns, but balance must be restored. A substitute is required. The message is unmistakable. Domains exist. Rules matter. Crossing them invites consequences. Even gods are not above the system they inhabit. By this point, a pattern is emerging. Rebellion. Compromise. Defiance. Theft of authority. Jurisdictional conflict. Each crisis is resolved just enough to continue, but never enough to heal the underlying fractures. The system survives, but it is under strain. And that strain will eventually break something far larger than a single city or a single god. As the centuries pass within the textual record, the tone begins to change. Earlier compositions speak confidently of divine presence. Gods walk their cities. They eat offerings. They sit in judgment. They argue in councils whose decisions shape the land directly. But as the timeline approaches the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, a darker voice enters the tablets. It is not speculative. It is not symbolic in the way myths often are. It is the voice of witnesses. These texts are known today as the Laments. They are among the most haunting documents ever written, not because of flowery language but because of their restraint. They do not describe a single battle or a heroic last stand. They describe collapse unfolding everywhere at once. Cities fall. Fields fail. Canals choke. Gods depart. The Sumerian world, at least on the surface, appears strong just before this collapse. The 3rd dynasty of Ur governs a large territory. Administration is centralized to an astonishing degree. Grain rations are standardized. Labor is scheduled. Laws are recorded and enforced. From a purely human perspective, this is a high point of early civilization. And then, within a remarkably short span of time, it ends. Around 2000 BCE, the dynasty falls. These explanations are valid. But the Laments insist there was more. They speak repeatedly of divine withdrawal. The phrasing is simple and devastating. The god left his house. The goddess abandoned her city. This is not described as defeat. The gods are not driven out by armies. They choose to leave. They refuse food and drink. They sever the ritual bond that tied them to their temples. Alongside this withdrawal appears another recurring phrase, the evil wind. The laments are careful to distinguish this wind from human enemies. Invaders are described as people with weapons. The evil wind is something else entirely. It moves across the land like a garment. It wraps the cities. It brings sickness. Animals die. Wells become foul. Fields turn white with salt. One text describes people dying where they stand, overcome by heat and breathless collapse. Another speaks of houses reduced not to rubble but to dust. Trees uprooted. Birds vanishing. The land ceasing to respond to cultivation. This is not a single storm. The timescale is measured in years, even generations. Fields do not fail permanently after one bad season. Wells do not become poisonous overnight. The laments speak of land so damaged it could not recover within living memory. Prices soar beyond reason. Families sell children for fractions of silver. Entire regions empty. The authors do not frame this as random misfortune. They insist it was authorized. Enlil decreed it. Anu confirmed it. Other gods withdrew protection. The destruction is described not as chaos, but as enforcement. A decision carried out. One text, the Curse of Agade, describes how Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon, attacked Enlil's temple in Nippur. As punishment, Enlil is said to have summoned destructive forces that swept over Akkad. But even here the narrative does not stop at invasion. It speaks of canals choking, fish dying, fields salting, and a city cursed never to be rebuilt. To this day, Akkad's ruins have never been securely identified. Modern scholarship often reads these passages as poetic exaggeration layered over drought, warfare, and political collapse. That interpretation fits the material evidence reasonably well. But what cannot be dismissed is how differently the laments speak about this destruction compared to earlier conflicts. Earlier wars are described plainly. This catastrophe is described as final. And here, the small Nineveh fragment returns to the conversation. When the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki. Placed beside the laments, the phrase acquires weight. The fragment speaks of weapons that burned without flame. The laments speak of scorching winds and poisoned land. The fragment speaks of a city where birds did not return for 40 years. The laments speak of entire regions emptied of life. Different texts. Different cities. The same language of irrevocable loss. Mainstream scholarship keeps these texts separate for good reason. They belong to different genres. They were written centuries apart. No single tablet tells a complete story of divine civil war. But the tablets themselves do not insist on those boundaries. They exist within a shared worldview where divine decisions, human suffering, and environmental collapse are interconnected. The laments also mark a profound shift in religious experience. Earlier hymns address gods as present. Later prayers speak across distance. Turn your face. Incline your ear. Look down from heaven. The grammar changes, and with it, the assumed relationship. The gods are no longer neighbors. They are distant authorities. When this shift is placed alongside the earlier narratives, a pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The Ijiji revolt shows strain at the bottom of the hierarchy. The creation of humans transfers labor downward. The flood vote reveals disagreement at the top. Enki's defiance breaks consensus. The Tablet of Destinies is stolen and reclaimed repeatedly. Inanna's descent exposes jurisdictional limits. And finally, the laments describe abandonment and devastation on a scale that ends an age. This is not the story of a stable system punctuated by isolated disasters. It reads like a long, uneven collapse. And then there is silence. After this period, the Anunnaki do not disappear entirely, but they change. They are invoked more than encountered. They are remembered rather than hosted. Temples continue, rituals continue, but the sense of immediate presence fades. Something fundamental has shifted. The scribes who copied these laments did not claim to understand everything that had happened. They did not offer a single explanation. They preserved the words as they were taught, even when those words described a world that no longer existed. Which brings us back once again to the role of memory. The Sumerian scribes did not present themselves as authors. They were transmitters. Many tablets end with notes stating they were copied from older, damaged originals. Some rituals preserve archaic language that later priests no longer spoke, yet continued to recite. Objects in temple inventories are described as relics from before the flood. They lived among ruins, operating systems whose original designers were gone. In such a world, preservation becomes an act of survival. You do not discard instructions simply because they no longer make sense. You copy them. You repeat them. You trust that someone before you knew why they mattered. When these scribes wrote of gods making war upon gods, they may not have been inventing drama. They may have been naming a process they believed had already played out, leaving only fragments behind. And fragments are exactly what we have. To understand why the Nineveh fragment is so unsettling, it helps to step inside the mindset of the people who copied it. The Sumerian and later Akkadian scribes were not storytellers in the modern sense. They were custodians. Their task was not to improve a narrative or make it more convincing. Their task was to preserve what had been handed down, even when it no longer aligned neatly with lived reality. Many tablets end with short notes written in smaller script. Copied from an old tablet. Copied from a damaged original. The writing was difficult to read. These are not literary flourishes. They are admissions. The scribes knew they were working with material already ancient, already fragmentary, already imperfect. Yet they copied it anyway. This attitude is crucial. It tells us that when a scribe recorded a phrase like when the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki, he was not necessarily asserting that he understood what it meant. He was asserting that this phrase existed in the tradition and therefore deserved preservation. In modern thinking, history is often reconstructed by smoothing over gaps. Contradictions are resolved. Impossibilities are explained away. The Sumerian approach was different. They allowed incompatible layers to coexist. Kings ruled for tens of thousands of years and then for normal lifespans side by side without comment. Gods walked cities and then departed without explanation. Catastrophes were attributed simultaneously to human enemies, environmental stress, and divine decree. Rather than choosing one explanation, they recorded all of them. The Nineveh fragment fits perfectly into this habit of preservation. It does not explain itself. It does not provide dates, names, or locations beyond a brief reference to a city possibly identifiable as Shuruppak. It simply states, the horror lies not in what is described, but in how little effort is made to dramatize it. Weapons that burned without flame. Soil poisoned for 3 harvests. A silence of birds lasting 40 years. These are not images of quick destruction. They imply long-term consequences. Damage that outlives the event itself. And this is where the fragment begins to resonate with the laments in a deeper way. The laments do not speak of rebuilding. They speak of permanent loss. Cities cursed never to rise again. Land that would not respond to cultivation. Places whose very ruins were said to bring sickness. This language goes beyond the normal cycle of conquest and recovery that characterized much of ancient Mesopotamian history. Wars were common. Cities fell and were rebuilt many times. But this event was remembered differently. The scribes who copied the laments centuries later were still performing them as ritual texts. They were recited aloud, memorized, taught. Their purpose was not merely to mourn but to remember. To keep alive the knowledge that something had gone wrong on a scale that ordinary explanations could not fully capture. At this point, it becomes clear that the idea of war, in these texts, does not need to mean a single dramatic battlefield clash. In Mesopotamian thought, war could also be administrative, legal, and cosmic. A war of decisions. A war of decrees. A war of withdrawn protection. The Anunnaki were bound together by a system of shared authority. Councils voted. Tablets were sealed. Domains were assigned. When that system fractured, the effects cascaded downward. Humans experienced famine, disease, displacement, and silence from their gods. From the human perspective, it felt like abandonment. From within the divine narrative, it looked like internal conflict. This reframing allows earlier episodes to fall into place. The Ijiji revolt was a form of internal conflict. The flood decision was a conflict over policy. Enki's defiance was a breach of collective authority. The thefts of the Tablet of Destinies were coups. Inanna's death in the underworld was a jurisdictional collision. None of these episodes destroyed the system outright. Each one weakened it. By the time of the laments, the accumulated strain appears to have reached a breaking point. What followed was not a clean transition to a new order, but a retreat. The gods did not announce their departure. They simply stopped showing up. Temples remained standing, but their houses were described as empty. Rituals continued, but prayers shifted in tone, pleading across distance rather than speaking face to face. This withdrawal has no dramatic climax. No final battle described in full. And that absence may itself be the most telling detail. If there was a final phase of conflict among the Anunnaki, it was not something the surviving human communities witnessed directly. They experienced only the consequences. From their perspective, the world became quieter. The canals failed. The fields stopped responding. The gods stopped answering. And so the scribes wrote. They wrote king lists that began before time made sense. They wrote myths that sounded like administrative records. They wrote laments that blamed winds rather than enemies. They wrote fragments that spoke of divine war without explanation. They did not know how all the pieces fit together. But they knew they belonged together. In doing so, they left behind something rare. Not a solved history, but an honest archive of uncertainty. For the modern reader, this is uncomfortable. We prefer clear categories. Myth or history. Symbol or fact. Allegory or event. The Sumerian tablets refuse to cooperate. They sit between those categories, quietly insisting that the people who wrote them did not experience their world as neatly divided. They lived in the aftermath of something they did not fully understand. And that, perhaps, is the most human element of all. When a civilization collapses, its buildings fall first. Then its political systems. Finally, its language. What survives longest are habits, assumptions, and stories that no longer quite make sense but are repeated anyway. Part 2 begins in that aftermath. Not at the height of Sumer, but in the world that inherited its ruins. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Sumer no longer existed as a living culture. Its cities were still inhabited, its temples still stood, but the people who lived among them spoke different languages and served new kings. Akkadian, Amorite, and later Babylonian dynasties ruled the land. And yet, in their scribal schools, the old texts were still copied with extraordinary care. This is not what usually happens after conquest. Conquerors often erase the past. They overwrite it. They destroy symbols of the old order. In Mesopotamia, the opposite occurred. New rulers presented themselves as rightful heirs to an ancient legacy they did not create. They restored Sumerian temples. They memorized Sumerian hymns. They trained scribes to write a language no one spoke at home. What? The answer lies not in nostalgia but in authority. Sumerian knowledge carried weight. It was considered foundational, closer to the origins of order itself. To rule Mesopotamia without invoking Sumer was to rule without legitimacy. Kings did not claim to invent law. They claimed to restore ancient justice. They did not present themselves as innovators. They presented themselves as caretakers of a system older than memory. This attitude shaped the way later cultures understood the gods. The Anunnaki did not vanish from the text. They were reorganized. In Babylonian theology, Marduk rises to prominence. He is not one of the original Sumerian creator gods. He is younger. His ascent is carefully justified through narrative. In the epic known as Enuma Elish, the universe itself is restructured to explain his authority. The story begins with chaos, not moral chaos but political disorder. The older gods fail to maintain stability. Councils argue. Authority fractures. A new threat emerges in the form of Tiamat, representing primordial power unbound by law. The gods panic. None will face her. Only Marduk offers to act, but he demands something unprecedented in return. Absolute authority. The gods agree. They grant him command. They give him the Tablet of Destinies. Only then does he confront Tiamat, defeat her, and reshape the cosmos from her body. The universe that follows is orderly, hierarchical, and centralized under a single supreme authority. This is not simply myth. It is political theory written in divine language. Where Sumerian theology depicts a distributed system of power, Babylonian theology insists on consolidation. Where earlier texts show constant negotiation among divine equals, Enuma Elish justifies permanent hierarchy. The message is unmistakable. Chaos results from divided authority. Stability requires central control. This shift is revealing. It suggests that by the time Enuma Elish was composed, the idea of a fractured divine council was no longer comforting. It was dangerous. It reminded people of a past where divine disagreement had real, catastrophic consequences. The solution was not to deny that past, but to overwrite it with a new narrative. One where conflict is resolved decisively. One where authority is clear. One where rebellion is impossible. And yet, traces of the older worldview remain embedded in the text. Marduk does not inherit authority naturally. He negotiates for it. The Tablet of Destiny still exists as a transferable object. Councils still vote. The structure is patched, not replaced. Even as Babylonian theology claims final stability, it cannot fully escape the memory of instability. This tension mirrors what was happening on the ground. Mesopotamia in the 2nd millennium BCE was a land of shifting powers. City-states rose and fell. Alliances formed and collapsed. Droughts and floods continued to threaten agriculture. No empire lasted indefinitely. Each new order claimed permanence, while quietly preparing for the possibility of collapse. In this environment, the old Sumerian texts served a new function. They became warnings, not explicit ones. No tablet states this happened before and could happen again. Instead, the warning is implicit. Systems fail. Authority fractures. Even gods can withdraw. Civilization is not guaranteed. Scribes were trained to copy these texts accurately, but not to explain them. Interpretation was dangerous. To interpret was to claim understanding of forces beyond human control. Better to preserve faithfully and leave meaning open. This is why contradictions remain untouched. Why laments are copied alongside hymns. Why divine wars are mentioned without context. The archive preserves tension because tension is the point. As we move deeper into part 2, attention shifts from divine actors to human response. How did later societies live with the belief that their world had already ended once before? How did that belief shape law, kingship, prophecy, and fear? The answer begins with a simple but profound shift in perspective. History was no longer something that progressed endlessly forward. It had already peaked. What remained was maintenance. And maintenance, when rooted in memory of catastrophe, changes everything. Once a civilization believes that collapse is possible, law stops being merely a tool for resolving disputes. It becomes a defensive structure. In Mesopotamia after Sumer, law was no longer presented as a human invention designed for convenience. It was framed as a barrier against chaos itself. This is why later law codes never begin with practical instructions. They begin with cosmology. When Hammurabi of Babylon carved his laws into stone around 1750 BCE, he did not introduce himself as a reformer. He presented himself as an agent. The opening lines are unambiguous. Anu and Enlil granted authority to Marduk. Marduk appointed Hammurabi. Hammurabi enforced justice. The chain of command is explicit, and it stretches back into divine history. Law in this worldview is not flexible. It is stabilizing. To alter it carelessly would risk reopening fractures that had once destroyed the world. This mindset explains the severity of many Mesopotamian legal punishments. To modern readers, they appear brutal and disproportionate. But within the inherited memory of collapse, harsh enforcement was preferable to disorder. Better an unjust law than no law at all. Better rigidity than uncertainty. The same principle appears in kingship. Earlier Sumerian rulers often described themselves as shepherds chosen by a city god. Their legitimacy was local and relational. Later kings described themselves as universal restorers. They do not merely govern cities. They maintain cosmic balance. Their inscriptions emphasize rebuilding temples, restoring canals, reviving ancient rituals. This obsession with restoration is revealing. You do not restore what you believe is progressing naturally. You restore what you fear is decaying. In royal inscriptions, disasters are never framed as accidents. Floods, plagues, and invasions are interpreted as signs of imbalance. The gods are displeased. A ritual was neglected. A boundary was crossed. A law was ignored. The solution is always corrective, never innovative. This fear of imbalance extends into prophecy. Mesopotamian divination was not primarily about predicting the future. It was about identifying warning signs. The liver of a sacrificed animal, the pattern of smoke, the movement of stars, even the behavior of ants, were all read as messages. Not messages about distant events but about the present state of cosmic order. An unfavorable omen did not mean disaster was inevitable. It meant disaster was possible. And possibility was enough to demand action. This explains why Mesopotamian religion appears so meticulous. Rituals were repeated exactly. Words were recited precisely. Deviations were avoided. Even pronunciation mattered. A mistake in a ritual was not a small error. It was a risk. In this context, the memory of divine conflict becomes a silent framework underlying everything. The gods were not imagined as eternally unified. They had disagreed before. They had withdrawn before. They could do so again. Human society therefore had a responsibility. Do not give them a reason. This responsibility extended to how history itself was written. Chronicles rarely dwell on human error alone. When a king fails, it is often because he ignored tradition. When a city falls, it is because it offended its god. This does not absolve human leaders of blame. On the contrary, it increases it. To rule badly is not just political failure. It is cosmic negligence. The weight of this belief is visible in how later cultures approached Sumerian ruins. Abandoned cities were not simply empty spaces. They were charged landscapes. Some were avoided entirely. Others were repurposed cautiously. Temples were rebuilt on ancient foundations, not because it was structurally convenient, but because continuity mattered. Breaking the line of inheritance felt dangerous. This inherited caution also shaped storytelling. Later myths become less experimental, less ambiguous. They favor resolution. Conflict is allowed only if it ends decisively. The divine hierarchy is clarified. Authority is concentrated. The universe becomes more orderly on paper, even if lived reality remains unstable. This is not optimism. It is anxiety management. By asserting that order is fixed and enforceable, these narratives attempt to suppress the possibility of another collapse like the one remembered in the Laments. They rewrite divine history not to erase conflict, but to contain it. Yet the older stories never disappear. They are still copied, still taught, still recited. Their contradictions remain intact. This coexistence suggests that no amount of legal or theological restructuring fully resolved the underlying fear. The world had already proven fragile. And so, Mesopotamian civilization lived in a permanent state of vigilance. Maintaining canals was not just economic necessity. It was ritual duty. Enforcing law was not just governance. It was cosmic maintenance. Remembering the past was not academic. It was survival. In this way, the shadow of Sumer's collapse extended far beyond its physical ruins. It shaped how later societies understood power, responsibility, and risk. It taught them that order was borrowed, not guaranteed. And borrowed things, once lost, are not easily recovered. If law was the skeleton holding civilization upright, divination was its nervous system. It sensed danger before it arrived. In post-Sumerian Mesopotamia, prophecy and omens were not fringe practices. They were central to governance, warfare, and daily life. Kings delayed campaigns because of them. Cities altered policies because of them. Entire rituals existed solely to neutralize their warnings. Their task was to determine whether the signs indicated that the balance was beginning to shift again. The universe was understood as responsive, not random. Every unusual event was meaningful. A malformed birth. An eclipse. A crack in a temple wall. None of these were accidents. They were messages. The most revealing aspect of this system is its logic. Omens were not interpreted morally. A negative sign did not mean someone had sinned. It meant a boundary had been crossed or neglected. The response was practical. Perform a counter-ritual. Replace a king symbolically. Delay a decision. Repair a neglected shrine. In extreme cases, a substitute king ritual was enacted. If the omens surrounding a ruler were overwhelmingly negative, a temporary king would be appointed, often a condemned criminal. He would sit on the throne for a fixed period, absorbing the predicted fate. At the end he would be executed and the real king would resume rule, theoretically cleansed of danger. This is not superstition in the casual sense. It is a system built on the belief that disaster follows patterns, and that those patterns can be redirected if caught early enough. The fear underlying this system is never stated directly, but it is always present. The fear is not of punishment. It is of abandonment. The Laments taught that when the gods withdraw there is no appeal. There is no negotiation. The system simply stops responding. Omens, therefore, were valuable not because they predicted destruction, but because they suggested the gods were still communicating. Silence was the true danger. This fear shaped prophecy as well. Mesopotamian prophecy is cautious. It does not speak in sweeping visions of a transformed future. It speaks in conditional statements. If this is done, then that will follow. If this sign appears, perform this ritual. The future is not fixed. It is managed. This management mentality extends into astronomy. The stars were not studied for curiosity. They were monitored for stability. Planetary movements were recorded obsessively. Deviations mattered. Venus, associated with Inanna, was particularly important. Irregularities in its cycle were interpreted as signs of social unrest, war, or divine displeasure. Here again, the memory of divine conflict casts a long shadow. Inanna herself was a goddess of contradiction. Love and war. Fertility and destruction. Her planet's unpredictable visibility mirrored her personality. To track Venus was to track instability itself. The same logic applied to eclipses. An eclipse was not merely a spectacle. It was a warning that the normal order had been temporarily suspended. Kings hid. Rituals were performed. Sometimes entire months were treated as dangerous. None of this behavior makes sense in a worldview that sees the universe as fundamentally stable. It makes perfect sense in one that remembers instability at the highest level of existence. What is striking is how little confidence these systems express in human control. Even with all precautions, disasters still occur. Omens are missed. Rituals fail. Kings die unexpectedly. Cities fall. The response is not denial but repetition. More rituals. More records. More precision. The scribes who compiled omen series such as Enuma, Anu and Enlil did not expect perfection. They expected diligence. Their work stretches across generations, adding cases, refining interpretations, acknowledging uncertainty. This is institutional memory at work. And memory once again is the key. These societies did not believe they were moving toward a better future. They believed they were holding back a worse one. Progress was not expansion. It was survival without collapse. This perspective also influenced how they viewed time. Time was cyclical but not endlessly forgiving. Certain thresholds, once crossed, could not be undone. The flood had happened. The Great Withdrawal had happened. These were reference points. The goal was not to prevent all change, but to avoid crossing another irreversible line. This helps explain why later Mesopotamian texts are filled with anxiety about repetition. Phrases appear again and again. May it not be like before. May the evil wind not return. May the god not abandon his house. They are prayers spoken by a culture that believes it has already seen the worst. As part 2 continues, the focus begins to narrow. We move from broad systems to individual voices. Prophets, lamenters, and ritual specialists who lived their entire lives under the weight of inherited catastrophe. They did not know exactly what had happened in the deep past, but they believed enough had happened to justify fear. And fear, when organized into institutions, becomes tradition. Behind the great systems of law, ritual, and divination stood individuals. Scribes bent over tablets. Priests memorized thousands of lines of liturgy. Lamenters trained their voices to carry grief with precision. These were not distant officials performing abstract duties. They were people living in the long shadow of a world they believed had already broken once before. Their writings reveal something the grand inscriptions often hide: doubt. Personal prayers from this period sound markedly different from the confident hymns of early Sumer. They are intimate, anxious, and often confused. The speaker does not assume divine favor. He pleads for attention. He lists his offerings. He insists he has followed the rules. And still he suffers. One common genre is the righteous sufferer text. The speaker insists on innocence, yet describes illness, poverty, abandonment by friends, and silence from the gods. He does not accuse the gods openly. That would be dangerous. Instead, he asks what boundary he unknowingly crossed. This question appears again and again. What did I do wrong without knowing it? Such a question only makes sense in a world where order is fragile and rules are vast. It suggests that disaster does not require intention. It requires oversight. A missed ritual. A forgotten offering. A neglected shrine. In this worldview, ignorance offers no protection. Yet these texts are not despairing. They continue to pray. The act of lament itself becomes a form of faith. To speak suffering aloud is to assert that the gods might still listen. Silence would mean resignation. Words, however fragile, are resistance. Lamenters held a formal role in temples. They were trained professionals, not spontaneous mourners. Their job was to give voice to communal grief in a way that followed strict conventions. Tone mattered. Metaphors mattered. Even pauses were prescribed. This precision was not aesthetic. It was functional. A properly performed lament was believed to soothe an angry god, to remind a departed deity of its bond with the city. The goal was not explanation. It was reconciliation. This is why laments often address gods who are absent. The speaker describes empty temples, overturned altars, silent streets. These descriptions are not accusations. They are invitations. Look at what has happened in your absence. In this way, lament becomes a bridge between a remembered past and an uncertain present. For individuals living centuries after Sumer's collapse, these rituals were not about reliving ancient trauma. They were about managing ongoing vulnerability. Every drought, every epidemic, every invasion echoed the older catastrophe. The past was not distant. It was a reference frame. Kings boast less about conquest and more about piety. Private individuals emphasize obedience over achievement. Even success is framed cautiously. Prosperity is thanked for immediately, as if it might vanish without warning. This attitude stands in contrast to later worldviews that celebrate progress and mastery. In Mesopotamia, mastery was temporary. Control was conditional. Survival depended on attentiveness. The gods, too, begin to change in these personal texts. They are less anthropomorphic, less present in physical form. They become forces to be interpreted rather than neighbors to be hosted. Dreams replace visits. Omens replace conversation. Distance increases. Yet relationship does not disappear. It becomes mediated. One prayer describes the god as a father who has turned his face away. Another as a judge who has not yet delivered a verdict. The metaphors shift, but the bond remains. Even abandonment is framed as temporary, because to imagine permanent abandonment would be unbearable. This tension produces a new kind of spirituality, one that accepts uncertainty as normal. People live their lives without expecting clarity. They perform rituals without guaranteed results. They obey laws without believing those laws will prevent all disaster. Faith becomes endurance. This is the human legacy of divine conflict. Not terror alone but caution. Not despair but restraint. Not blind obedience but careful repetition. As Part 2 nears its close, a pattern emerges. Systems are built to prevent collapse. Rituals are performed to maintain attention. Stories are preserved to remember what happens when balance fails. Individuals internalize these lessons, shaping behavior across generations. The world has not ended again. Not yet. But the memory that it once did remains active, shaping every decision. And it is this inherited vigilance, more than any single event, that defines the post-Sumerian age. By the end of the second millennium BCE, Mesopotamian civilization had learned how to live with fear without being paralyzed by it. This balance did not come easily and it was never complete. But it shaped everything that followed, from theology to daily routine, from kingship to private prayer. Part 2 concludes not with a dramatic revelation, but with an understanding. Survival had become a discipline. The memory of collapse was no longer a single story told in laments. It had been absorbed into habit. Cities were planned with redundancy. Canals had secondary channels. Storehouses were overbuilt. Temples maintained detailed inventories not because wealth was abundant, but because scarcity was expected. Bureaucracy, often criticized today as inefficiency, was in Mesopotamia a form of preparedness. Even writing itself reflects this shift. Administrative records grow more detailed over time. Measurements are standardized. Dates are carefully recorded. Nothing is left to assumption. A world that remembers chaos does not trust improvisation. The same principle applies to religion. Gods are still worshipped, but enthusiasm gives way to procedure. Festivals follow exact calendars. Offerings are prescribed down to the smallest unit. Innovation is discouraged. The goal is not emotional expression, but continuity. This does not mean belief weakens. It means belief becomes disciplined. In earlier Sumerian texts, gods act impulsively. They argue, threaten, change their minds. In later theology, divine behavior becomes more predictable, more rule-bound. This is not because the gods have changed but because humans need them to be stable. Stability becomes the highest value. This value reshapes myth itself. Stories are reinterpreted to emphasize resolution rather than conflict. The flood becomes a controlled reset rather than a near-total annihilation. Divine wars are reframed as necessary transitions. Chaos is acknowledged but always contained. Yet containment is never absolute. The older texts remain in circulation, quietly resisting full integration. Laments continue to be copied. Contradictions persist. The Nineveh fragment is not erased. It is archived. This suggests that Mesopotamian culture did not fully trust its own solutions. They knew order was maintained, not guaranteed. This awareness produces a subtle but powerful ethical stance. Responsibility does not end with obedience. One must remain alert, watchful, attentive to signs. Faith is not passive. It is a practice. In this sense, the Mesopotamian legacy is profoundly modern. It recognizes complexity. It accepts uncertainty. It builds systems not because they are perfect but because imperfection is inevitable. As Part 2 closes, the focus begins to shift outward. The ideas forged in Mesopotamia did not remain confined to its river valleys. They traveled with merchants, captives, scribes, and stories. They crossed borders. They entered new languages. They reshaped other traditions. The memory of divine conflict, of withdrawal, of catastrophic imbalance, did not disappear. It transformed. In the next phase, we will trace how these ideas surface in later cultures, not as direct copies but as echoes. Flood stories, fallen divine beings, laws given from above, apocalyptic warnings. The fear that the world might end again, not through moral failure alone, but through systemic fracture. Part 3 will follow these echoes as they move westward and southward, into cultures that inherited Mesopotamian thought without inheriting its original context. What survives is not a single story but a framework. A framework that asks a question still relevant today: what happens when those entrusted with order can no longer maintain it? By the late 2nd millennium BCE, the memory of collapse had traveled far beyond the land where it first took shape. Mesopotamia was no longer the uncontested center of intellectual gravity, yet its ideas moved quietly along trade routes, diplomatic exchanges, and forced migrations. Clay tablets did not need to be carried physically for their influence to spread. Scribes moved. Priests moved. Captives moved. And with them traveled assumptions about how the world worked, what caused catastrophe, and how close civilization always was to its own undoing. What emerged in neighboring cultures was not a simple copying of Sumerian myths, but something more subtle. A shared anxiety. A shared framework for understanding disaster as something systemic rather than random. In this new context, stories of divine conflict did not disappear. They changed form. In the lands to the west, along the Levantine corridor, smaller city-states developed their own religious traditions while absorbing Mesopotamian concepts almost unconsciously. Here, gods were fewer in number, but the tension between order and chaos remained central. Storm gods battled sea gods. High gods presided from a distance while subordinate beings carried out violent work on the ground. Divine councils still appeared, though increasingly they were implied rather than explicitly described. The memory of internal divine conflict was no longer narrated openly as war among gods. Instead, it was reframed as rebellion, disobedience, or corruption within the. In this way, earlier memories of fractured authority survived, but in a form that could be controlled. One of the clearest places where this transformation can be observed is in the evolution of flood narratives. The Mesopotamian flood stories are administrative in tone. They read like records of a decision made under pressure. Humanity is noisy. A solution is proposed. The council agrees. The consequences follow. In later traditions, the same event becomes moral. Humanity is wicked. The flood is punishment. On the surface, this looks like a profound change. But beneath it lies continuity. In both cases, the flood represents a reset imposed from above because the system below has become unmanageable. What changes is not the function of the flood, but the explanation given for it. Moral language replaces logistical language. The fear remains the same. This moralization serves an important purpose. It restores a sense of predictability. If disaster follows sin, then obedience offers protection. This is psychologically safer than the Mesopotamian worldview, where disaster can follow from sheer scale, noise, or unintended imbalance. But the older anxiety does not vanish entirely. Even in moralist flood stories, the destruction is nearly total. Innocents perish alongside the guilty. Survival depends not on collective repentance, but on selective warning. One family is told. One vessel is built. The randomness remains, quietly undermining the moral frame meant to contain it. Alongside flood stories, another motif travels widely: the fall of divine or semi-divine beings. In Mesopotamian tradition, rebellion among the Igigi leads to the creation of humanity. In later cultures, this becomes a story of watchers, angels, or lesser gods who overstep boundaries. They descend. They teach forbidden knowledge. They disrupt order. The response is punishment and confinement. Once again, the pattern is recognizable. A lower tier of the divine hierarchy rebels. The system responds by removing them from participation in the world. Humanity inherits the consequences. What is striking is how often forbidden knowledge appears in these stories. Metallurgy, agriculture, astronomy, writing. These are not portrayed as neutral gifts. They are dangerous accelerants. They increase human capability faster than human restraint. This echoes the Mesopotamian fear of unchecked growth that originally justified drastic intervention. Knowledge, in these traditions, is not simply empowering. It is destabilizing. And those who deliver it outside authorized channels threaten the balance of the entire system. By the early 1st millennium BCE, this anxiety crystallizes into a new genre: apocalyptic thought. Apocalypse does not mean destruction in the modern sense. It means revelation, an unveiling of hidden structures. Apocalyptic texts do not predict the end of the world as such. They predict the exposure of the forces that have been quietly shaping it all along. These texts emerge most clearly in cultures that experienced repeated conquest, exile, and displacement. For them, collapse is not theoretical. It is lived experience. Apocalyptic writing shares several features with the earlier Mesopotamian laments: the sense of inevitability, the scale of destruction, the involvement of cosmic forces. The difference lies in direction. Laments look backward, mourning what has been lost. Apocalyptic texts look forward, warning of what will happen if imbalance continues. Both assume that history is fragile and reversible. Both assume that systems can fail catastrophically. And both assume that such failure originates not solely in human wrongdoing, but in breakdowns at higher levels of authority. In apocalyptic literature, divine conflict becomes increasingly abstract. Angels battle. Powers and principalities clash. The language is symbolic, but the structure remains administrative. Authority is contested. Decrees are issued. Timelines are fixed. The universe is imagined as governed by laws that can be suspended under certain conditions. These are not the fantasies of naive believers. They are the intellectual descendants of a civilization that learned, painfully, that order is conditional. At the same time, these later traditions attempt to resolve the unresolved. Where Mesopotamian texts preserve contradiction, apocalyptic texts promise closure. There will be a final judgment. A final restoration. A permanent resolution to conflict. This promise responds directly to the unease left by earlier narratives. If divine conflict once shattered the world, then it must one day be definitively ended. The future becomes a corrective to the past. Yet even here, traces of the older uncertainty remain. Apocalyptic timelines are repeatedly revised. Predictions are deferred. Explanations multiply. The final resolution never quite arrives. Each generation inherits the expectation, adjusts it, and passes it on. In this way, apocalyptic thought becomes less about prediction and more about endurance. It teaches communities how to live under prolonged instability without losing coherence. What unites these developments is not belief in a specific event, but belief in a pattern. Order arises. Order strains. Order collapses. Something intervenes. A new order emerges, carrying memory of the old failure within it. This pattern is not explicitly taught. It is absorbed through stories, rituals, and assumptions about how reality behaves. It becomes common sense. By the time Greek thinkers begin to engage seriously with Near Eastern ideas, this pattern has already been internalized. Greek mythology openly depicts gods in conflict, but Greek philosophy reacts against this. Plato, for example, insists that true divinity must be perfectly rational and unified. Myths of divine conflict are relegated to allegory or dismissed as corruptions. This philosophical move is telling. It represents an attempt to escape inherited anxiety by redefining the divine itself. If gods are perfect, then collapse cannot originate from above. But the old fear simply migrates. If the gods are perfect, then disorder must come from somewhere else. From fate. From matter. From human ignorance. Greek tragedy gives voice to this displacement. Even when gods are just, disaster still occurs. Systems still fail. Heroes still fall despite good intentions. The universe remains dangerous, only now the danger is framed as impersonal necessity rather than divine disagreement. This philosophical turn does not erase the Mesopotamian legacy. It reframes it. The fear of collapse is no longer narrated as divine war, but as imbalance between reason and passion, form and matter, order and chaos. The language changes. The structure remains. Civilization is still understood as something held together against constant pressure. As these ideas spread further into Roman, Persian, and later religious traditions, they continue to adapt. Empires prefer narratives that emphasize stability and legitimacy. Yet beneath official theology, the old memory persists. It appears in warnings about decadence, in fears of decline, in prophecies of renewal, and proved adaptable across cultures. A recognition that complexity creates vulnerability, that authority can fracture, that recovery is not guaranteed. This inheritance shapes how later societies imagine both their origins and their endings. Creation stories emphasize imposed order. End-time stories emphasize withdrawal or intervention. In both cases, the human role is limited. Humanity responds. It does not initiate. This perspective produces humility but also anxiety. If the forces that truly govern reality operate beyond human control, then vigilance becomes a moral duty. As this part continues, the focus will narrow again, this time toward the modern world. Not to draw simplistic parallels, but to examine how this ancient framework still influences contemporary thinking about collapse, progress, and responsibility. The question is no longer whether divine beings still make war upon one another. The question is whether the structures that replace them are any less fragile. As the modern world emerged from the long shadow of antiquity, it did not leave these inherited patterns behind. It reinterpreted them. Where ancient society spoke of gods withdrawing, modern societies speak of systems failing. Where earlier texts described divine councils fracturing, contemporary language describes institutions losing coherence. The vocabulary has changed, but the underlying structure remains remarkably consistent. Collapse is no longer framed as supernatural punishment, yet it is still understood as something that arises when complexity exceeds control. The scientific revolution promised liberation from fear rooted in myth. Nature would be understood, predicted, and mastered. Yet even as confidence in human reason grew, a familiar anxiety resurfaced. Early modern thinkers began to notice that progress itself created instability. Empires expanded faster than they could govern. Technology spread faster than social norms could adapt. Information multiplied faster than wisdom. These observations did not produce optimism. They produced warnings. The concept of systemic collapse entered secular thought quietly, through economics, ecology, and political theory. Adam Smith recognized that markets required invisible balances to function. Thomas Malthus warned that population growth could outpace resources. Later, historians such as Edward Gibbon framed the fall of Rome not as a single catastrophe, but as a slow erosion of internal cohesion. None of these thinkers invoked divine war. Yet each described a system undermined by its own structure. What makes this continuity remarkable is how often modern explanations mirror ancient ones in form, if not in language. Ancient texts speak of land rendered barren. Modern studies speak of soil exhaustion. Ancient laments describe poisoned wells. Modern reports describe contaminated water tables. Ancient scribes record cities abandoned for generations. Modern archaeology documents urban desertion following environmental stress. The causes differ in detail, but the narrative arc is familiar. As industrialization accelerated, this arc became impossible to ignore. The 19th and 20th centuries witnessed unprecedented growth paired with unprecedented destruction. Two world wars demonstrated how technological progress could amplify conflict rather than prevent it. Nuclear weapons introduced the possibility of irreversible damage on a scale previously reserved for myth. The phrase "weapons that burned without flame," once confined to clay fragments, acquired a chilling resonance in the age of radiation. Yet even here, caution is required. Drawing direct equivalence between ancient metaphor and modern technology risks oversimplification. The value of the comparison lies not in claiming foreknowledge, but in recognizing recurring patterns of fear and interpretation. Ancient peoples did not need nuclear physics to understand that some forces, once unleashed, permanently alter the land. They observed salt-encrusted fields, poisoned soil, and long-term abandonment. From their perspective, the cause mattered less than the consequence. Loss beyond repair. Modern societies, despite their scientific sophistication, wrestle with the same anxiety. Climate models predict thresholds beyond which recovery becomes uncertain. Ecologists speak of tipping points. Economists warn of cascading failures. Political scientists analyze institutional decay. Each field, independently, arrives at a conclusion deeply familiar to the ancient scribes. Systems can absorb stress only up to a point. What distinguishes the modern response is not certainty, but fragmentation. Ancient societies unified explanation through cosmology. Modern societies divide explanation into disciplines. No single narrative holds authority. As a result, warnings multiply without convergence. Climate scientists issue reports. Economists release forecasts. Sociologists analyze trends. Yet action remains hesitant, contested, delayed. The absence of a shared framework produces paralysis rather than cohesion. This fragmentation echoes the ancient fear of fractured authority. In Mesopotamian thought, disaster followed when divine consensus broke down. In modern terms, disaster follows when institutions fail to coordinate. The analogy is structural, not literal. Authority, whether divine or bureaucratic, functions as a stabilizing mechanism. When it fragments, response is slow. Conflicts escalate. Consequences spread unchecked. The modern world also inherits another ancient trait, the tendency to moralize collapse after it occurs. Economic crises are attributed to greed. Environmental disasters to negligence. Political failures to corruption. These explanations are often accurate, yet incomplete. They focus on individual behavior rather than systemic limits. This mirrors later flood narratives that emphasized sin over scale. Moral language restores a sense of control, but it obscures deeper vulnerabilities. At the same time, modern narratives struggle with the idea of abandonment. In a secular age, there is no God to leave the house. Instead, people speak of institutions losing legitimacy, of trust eroding, of systems no longer responding to those they govern. The emotional experience is strikingly similar. People feel unheard, unprotected, exposed. The language of alienation replaces the language of divine withdrawal, but the psychological effect is nearly identical. Technology intensifies this experience. Digital systems promise connection, efficiency, and transparency. Yet they also introduce fragility. Complex networks fail in nonlinear ways. Small disruptions cascade into widespread outages. Control becomes abstract, centralized, and opaque. When these systems fail, there is no visible authority to appeal to. Responsibility dissolves into processes and algorithms. The sense of abandonment deepens. In this environment, apocalyptic thinking resurfaces, often stripped of overt religious language. Artificial intelligence is framed as an existential threat. Climate change is described as an approaching end. Pandemics revive fears of uncontrollable spread. It reminds societies that permanence is an illusion. The danger lies not in imagining collapse, but in believing collapse is impossible. Ancient Mesopotamian civilization did not fall because its people feared disaster. It fell because the systems sustaining it were stretched beyond resilience. The laments do not condemn vigilance. They mourn the moment vigilance failed. This distinction matters. Fear, when integrated into planning, produces caution. Fear ignored produces shock. As modern societies confront global challenges that resist simple solutions, the ancient archive offers an unexpected lesson. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty. That is impossible. The goal is to design systems that acknowledge uncertainty without collapsing under it. Redundancy, flexibility, memory. These are not signs of weakness. They are survival strategies. Memory in particular plays a crucial role. Ancient scribes preserved texts they did not fully understand because they believed forgetting was dangerous. Modern cultures, by contrast, often prioritize innovation over preservation. Technologies become obsolete within decades. Knowledge is archived digitally, vulnerable to decay. Institutions value disruption over continuity. In such a context, the loss of memory accelerates vulnerability. This does not mean the modern world should return to ancient cosmologies. It means recognizing that the human relationship with complexity has not fundamentally changed. We still build systems we do not fully control. We still rely on coordination among authorities with competing interests. We still experience collapse as both material loss and existential shock. As this part approaches its conclusion, the thread connecting ancient and modern becomes clearer. The story is not about gods or even about specific events. It is about how societies understand responsibility in systems larger than any individual. Ancient texts express this through divine hierarchy. Modern discourse expresses it through institutional analysis. Both grapple with the same question: who is accountable when the system fails? This question has no simple answer. In Mesopotamia, blame oscillated between gods and humans. In the modern world, it oscillates between leaders, structures, and abstract forces. The oscillation itself is revealing. It suggests an underlying discomfort with distributed responsibility. People seek a focal point for accountability because diffuse failure is psychologically intolerable. The enduring power of the ancient narratives lies in their refusal to resolve this discomfort. They preserve contradiction. They acknowledge multiple causes. They accept that some failures are irreversible. This honesty, unsettling as it is, offers a form of clarity. It reminds us that stability is achieved, not inherited. Maintained, not assumed. IT does not conclude with a warning or a prophecy. It concludes with a recognition. The patterns observed in ancient clay are not relics of a primitive past. They are reflections of a recurring human predicament. As long as societies build complex systems, they will confront the possibility of systemic failure. As long as authority is distributed, it will strain under pressure. As long as memory fades, mistakes will repeat. In the final movement of this work, part will turn inward. Having traced the external patterns of collapse and inheritance, it will examine the psychological dimension. How individuals internalize the fear of systemic failure. How belief adapts in environments of uncertainty. And how meaning is constructed when guarantees disappear. The question will no longer be how civilizations fall, but how people live knowing that they can. When societies lose confidence in permanence, the effect is not only political or economic. It is psychological. Long before buildings fall or institutions dissolve, something more intimate begins to shift: how individuals understand their place in the world. The Mesopotamian archive makes this clear. Collapse was never experienced solely as external catastrophe. It was absorbed internally, shaping how people thought, felt, prayed, obeyed, and endured. In early Sumerian texts, humans appear as participants in a living system. Gods are present. Authority is visible. Rituals have immediate feedback. Offerings are consumed. Prayers are answered. This creates a sense of proximity. The divine world is not distant or abstract. It is part of the same environment as canals, fields, and city walls. When something goes wrong, the cause can be negotiated, appeased, corrected. After collapse, that proximity dissolves. The gods do not vanish entirely, but they recede. Communication becomes indirect. Interpretation replaces conversation. The individual no longer expects clarity. This shift produces a new psychological posture. Vigilance without certainty. People act not because they understand outcomes, but because inaction feels dangerous. This posture is visible in the most personal texts of the post-Sumerian world. Private prayers no longer assume divine favor. They ask for attention. They emphasize obedience. They rehearse compliance in meticulous detail. The speaker lists offerings, rituals performed, days observed. The logic is defensive. If disaster comes, it must not be because I failed to follow the rules. This mindset transforms ethics. Morality is no longer primarily about intention. It is about alignment. Doing the right thing is less important than doing the prescribed thing correctly. Innovation becomes suspect. Deviation becomes risky. Even virtue is approached cautiously, because standing out attracts attention, and attention can be dangerous. From a modern perspective, this can look like passivity or fear. But within its historical context, it is a survival strategy. When systems fail unpredictably, individuals seek safety and conformity. If collapse cannot be prevented, it can at least be endured with minimal exposure. This is not cowardice. It is adaptation. Over time, this adaptation becomes culture. Children are raised to respect boundaries they do not fully understand. Traditions are followed because they have always been followed. Elders are trusted not because they possess explanations, but because they carry memory. Authority is legitimized through age, continuity, and repetition rather than innovation or charisma. This produces stability of a particular kind. Not the dynamic stability of growth, but the static stability of maintenance. Societies organized around this principle can endure for centuries, even millennia, with relatively little change. But the cost is creativity. The fear of triggering imbalance suppresses experimentation. Yet even in such environments, doubt persists. The righteous sufferer texts reveal individuals struggling to reconcile obedience with misfortune. These speakers have done everything correctly. They have followed the rules. And still they suffer. This creates a psychological fracture that no amount of ritual precision can fully repair. The response to this fracture is not rebellion. It is introspection. Suffering is interpreted as evidence of hidden error. Perhaps a boundary was crossed unknowingly. Perhaps a god was offended without warning. This reinforces the sense that the system is vast, complex, and partially unknowable. Humans are not punished for intent alone, but for misalignment with. Gratitude is expressed immediately, not because generosity is expected, but because loss is anticipated. Over generations, this anxiety becomes normalized. People do not describe themselves as fearful. They describe themselves as careful. Carefulness becomes a virtue. Recklessness becomes a moral failing. Excess is discouraged. Restraint is praised. These values are embedded in law, ritual, and social expectation. What is remarkable is how resilient this psychological structure proves to be. Even as political regimes change, the underlying posture remains. Empires rise and fall, but the individual's relationship to uncertainty persists. This suggests that the most enduring legacy of collapse is not institutional but internal. When these ideas spread into later religious traditions, they undergo reinterpretation but not elimination. Concepts such as sin, obedience, covenant, and judgment absorb earlier anxieties about alignment and abandonment. The language becomes moral, but the emotional core remains defensive. Do not provoke withdrawal. Do not break the bond. Do not assume protection. In monotheistic traditions, this dynamic intensifies. With fewer divine actors, responsibility concentrates. If disaster occurs, it must reflect a breakdown in the relationship between humanity and the single source of order. This produces intense self-examination. Collective suffering is interpreted as collective failure, even when causes are structural or environmental. At the same time, monotheism introduces a powerful counterbalance. Meaning, if suffering is part of a plan, then endurance is purposeful. This offers psychological relief unavailable in earlier systems. Yet it also increases pressure. If suffering has meaning, then it must be borne correctly. Complaint becomes dangerous. Doubt becomes transgressive. These tensions shape entire cultures. They influence attitudes toward authority, progress, and responsibility. They determine how societies respond to warning signs. Some double down on obedience. Others seek reform. A few attempt radical transformation. Most oscillate between caution and hope. In modern secular societies, these patterns do not disappear. They reappear under different names. Risk management replaces ritual. Compliance replaces obedience. Experts replace priests. Yet the underlying psychology remains. People seek reassurance from systems they do not fully understand. They follow procedures not because they guarantee success, but because deviation feels unsafe. The modern individual lives under constant exposure to systemic risk. Economic downturns, environmental crises, technological disruption, political instability. Unlike ancient peoples, modern individuals receive continuous information about these threats. The result is not clarity but chronic alertness. Anxiety becomes ambient. This ambient anxiety produces two opposing responses. Some retreat into rigid adherence to rules, ideologies, or identities. Others reject structure entirely, embracing nihilism or radical autonomy. Both responses are attempts to regain a sense of control. Both echo ancient strategies, ritual precision and withdrawal. Between these extremes lies a third path, conscious endurance. This path recognizes uncertainty without surrendering agency. It does not promise safety. It offers resilience. Ancient texts gesture toward this posture, though they rarely articulate it directly. It appears in the persistence of scribes, the discipline of lamenters, the refusal to forget even when forgetting would be easier. Memory once again becomes central. Remembering collapse does not prevent suffering. It prepares the mind to endure it without losing coherence. This may be the most profound psychological inheritance of the ancient world. Not fear but readiness. As continues, we will examine how this readiness shapes identity itself. How individuals construct meaning when certainty is unavailable. How belief evolves from assurance to practice. And how, in the absence of guarantees, people learn to live without waiting for resolution. When certainty dissolves, identity becomes provisional. This is one of the quiet truths embedded in the ancient texts and carried forward through centuries of cultural adaptation. In stable worlds, identity is inherited with little friction. One is born into a city, a profession, a set of rituals, and a shared future. Meaning is reinforced by repetition. In unstable worlds, identity must be maintained deliberately. It becomes something practiced rather than assumed. In the aftermath of collapse, people no longer expect continuity to take care of itself. Roles remain, but their permanence is questioned. A king may reign, but for how long? A city may prosper, but at what cost? A god may protect, but under what conditions? This uncertainty produces identities built around responsibility rather than entitlement. One is not simply a citizen. One is a caretaker. Not merely a believer but an observer. Not just a subject but a participant in maintenance. This shift is visible in how individuals describe themselves in personal texts. Rather than asserting status, they assert function. I serve. I watch. I preserve. These verbs replace declarations of worth. The self is defined less by achievement and more by reliability. To endure is to fulfill one's role correctly, even when reward is uncertain. Such identities are resilient but heavy. They place the burden of stability on the individual, even when instability originates beyond individual control. This creates a tension that runs through much of later ethical thought. If the system fails despite obedience, what does responsibility mean? Is one accountable for outcomes or only for effort? Ancient texts lean toward the latter. They do not promise justice in the modern sense. They promise recognition. To be seen as obedient, loyal, attentive. This is why laments emphasize visibility. Look at me. Hear me. Remember me. In a world where outcomes cannot be guaranteed, being acknowledged becomes its own form of meaning. This emphasis on recognition carries forward into later traditions. Martyrdom, witness, testimony. These concepts do not require success. They require endurance. To remain faithful under pressure becomes a form of victory, even when circumstances remain unchanged. This reframing allows identity to survive in environments where external validation is scarce. At the same time, this posture introduces vulnerability. If identity depends on constant maintenance, exhaustion becomes a risk. Burnout, though a modern term, describes an ancient experience. The individual carries vigilance across years, sometimes across generations. Relief is rare. When it comes, it is often interpreted as temporary. Communities respond by ritualizing rest. Festivals, Sabbaths, cycles of renewal. These are not luxuries. They are psychological safeguards. Without them, vigilance collapses into despair. Ancient societies understood this intuitively. Even as they feared disruption, they built pauses into their calendars. Discipline provides structure when external structures fail. This helps explain why many ancient traditions resisted theological innovation even when social conditions changed. Innovation introduces uncertainty. In uncertain worlds, continuity is safer. This does not mean ancient peoples were intellectually stagnant. They were selective. Innovation was permitted where risk was contained. Core structures remained untouched. Over time, this selectivity shaped collective identity. Cultures define themselves not by expansion, but by preservation. What mattered was not how far one could go, but how long one could last. Longevity became a value in itself. This value persists in subtle ways. Even today, institutions praise sustainability, resilience, and legacy. These concepts are not purely modern. They are inherited responses to remembered fragility. They reflect a desire to avoid repeating irreversible loss. The psychological cost of this inheritance is ambivalence toward progress. Advancement promises improvement but also risk. Each new capability introduces potential imbalance. Ancient fears resurface in modern debates over technology, governance, and growth. The language changes. The hesitation remains. Individuals navigating this tension develop layered identities. Public conformity may coexist with private doubt. Ritual obedience may coexist with personal questioning. This duality is not hypocrisy. It is adaptation. It allows participation in collective stability without suppressing individual uncertainty entirely. Texts from late antiquity and beyond increasingly reflect this duality. Authors write with awareness of contradiction. They acknowledge doubt without resolving it. They explore suffering without offering simple explanations. This literary honesty emerges from centuries of living with unanswered questions. As part continues, the focus shifts from inherited psychology to conscious choice. At what point does vigilance become self-imposed rather than culturally inherited? How do individuals decide which fears to carry forward and which to release? The ancient archive offers no direct answers, but it provides a framework for asking the question. The persistence of memory ensures that collapse is never fully past. But memory does not dictate response. It offers context. How one lives with that context becomes a matter of agency. The final movement of Part 5 will examine moments where individuals and communities choose reinterpretation over repetition, where fear is acknowledged but not allowed to dominate. These moments are rare, fragile, and often short-lived. But they demonstrate that even in worlds shaped by collapse, new orientations are possible. There comes a point in every long-lived tradition where memory stops being merely inherited and begins to be examined. This transition is subtle. It does not announce itself with reform or rebellion. It begins quietly, within individuals who recognize the weight they are carrying and begin to ask whether all of it is still necessary. In the ancient world, such questioning was rare and often dangerous. But it occurred nonetheless, leaving faint traces in texts that speak not only of obedience but of discernment. These moments are not revolutions. They are recalibrations. Individuals do not reject the past outright. They reinterpret it. They ask which elements of inherited vigilance still serve survival and which perpetuate unnecessary fear. This distinction is delicate. Abandon too much and the system risks collapse. Abandon too little and life becomes unbearable. One of the clearest signs of this shift appears in later wisdom literature. Unlike law codes or ritual manuals, wisdom texts focus on lived experience. They observe patterns without prescribing rigid responses. They acknowledge that the righteous may suffer and the unjust may prosper. They do not deny order, but they admit its opacity. This is not cynicism. It is maturity. In these texts, obedience remains important, but it is no longer sufficient. Attention turns inward. Intention begins to matter alongside action. The individual is encouraged to cultivate discernment, patience, and restraint rather than simply following procedures. This represents a subtle but profound psychological evolution. Responsibility is no longer only about alignment with external systems. It is also about internal balance. This internalization of responsibility does not erase fear of collapse. It reframes it. Collapse becomes not only a historical event or future threat, but a personal possibility. One can collapse internally even when society remains intact. Despair, arrogance, and despair disguised as certainty become dangers equal to external catastrophe. Such insights often emerge after long periods of stability, when immediate survival no longer consumes all attention. Distance from trauma allows reflection. Yet the memory of trauma remains close enough to inform caution. This balance produces a new ethical stance, cautious openness. One may question without abandoning. One may adapt without forgetting. Communities that achieve this balance tend to produce their most reflective thinkers. These individuals do not offer grand solutions. They offer perspective. They remind others that not every disruption signals the end. That endurance does not require constant alarm. That vigilance can coexist with trust. This trust is not naive. It does not assume protection. It assumes continuity of effort. The future is not guaranteed, but it is not foreclosed either. Meaning is found not in preventing all collapse, but in responding to instability with coherence rather than panic. This stance alters how time itself is perceived. Instead of viewing history as a series of rises and falls, it becomes a continuum of adjustment. Collapse is not an endpoint. It is a condition that can be approached, avoided, entered, or survived. This fluid understanding reduces the absolute terror associated with failure. It makes resilience imaginable. In such a worldview, memory serves a different function. It no longer exists solely to warn. It also instructs. Past failures are studied not to assign blame, but to recognize patterns. This is where history becomes analytical rather than purely commemorative. The ancient archive, once a repository of grief, becomes a resource. This transformation is fragile. It depends on education, transmission, and trust. When memory is weaponized, fear returns. When it is forgotten, repetition follows. The middle path is narrow and difficult to maintain. At the individual level, this manifests as a shift from inherited anxiety to chosen responsibility. One does not carry fear because ancestors carried it. One carries awareness because awareness proves useful. This distinction matters. Fear constrains. Awareness enables. The ancient world did not articulate this distinction explicitly, but it lived its consequences. Civilizations that ossified under fear eventually stagnated. Those that abandoned caution entirely exposed themselves to sudden collapse. The most enduring societies oscillated, correcting course repeatedly without losing coherence. As this part draws to a close, the psychological arc becomes clear. Stories, rituals, philosophies, and institutions all serve this purpose. They did not promise safety. They promised continuity of meaning. The significance of this evolution cannot be overstated. It marks the moment when collapse ceases to be purely traumatic and becomes instructive. When memory shifts from burden to guide. When survival is no longer reactive but intentional. This psychological maturation sets the stage for the final synthesis. Having traced collapse through divine conflict, institutional failure, cultural inheritance, and individual psychology, the remaining question is not historical. It is existential. What does it mean to live in a world where collapse is possible, remembered, and yet not inevitable? This will address this question directly. Not by offering reassurance, but by drawing together the threads of ancient memory and modern responsibility. It will examine how meaning persists when certainty does not, and how humanity continues to build despite knowing how easily building can fail. By the time the modern world begins to recognize the possibility of its own collapse, the ancient world has already left behind a map. Not a blueprint, not a prophecy, but a pattern of response etched into memory, ritual, and thought. The value of this inheritance is not that it predicts the future. It is that it clarifies the stakes. It reminds humanity that collapse is not an abstract concept reserved for distant civilizations. It is a recurring condition that emerges when complexity, authority, and responsibility fall out of alignment. What distinguishes the present moment from those that came before is scale. Never before has a single civilization extended its influence across the entire planet. Never before have systems of production, communication, and governance been so tightly interwoven. This interdependence creates unprecedented resilience, but it also creates unprecedented fragility. A failure in one domain propagates rapidly across others. The ancient scribes understood cascading failure intuitively, even if they lacked the language to formalize it. They observed that when canals failed, cities followed. When rituals ceased, confidence eroded. When authority fractured, disorder spread. In the modern world, these dynamics are magnified. Energy grids, financial systems, supply chains, and digital networks form invisible architectures upon which daily life depends. Most individuals do not understand how these systems function, only that they usually do. This mirrors the ancient relationship between humans and gods. Authority is distant, abstract, and powerful. Trust is implicit until it is broken. When breakdown occurs, the shock is disproportionate to the material damage. What collapses first is not infrastructure but assumption. The belief that systems will respond, that support will arrive, that continuity is normal. This psychological rupture is identical in form to the ancient experience of divine withdrawal. The names have changed. The sensation has not. Faced with this reality, modern societies oscillate between denial and alarm. Some insist collapse is impossible, citing technological advancement and historical progress. Others predict imminent catastrophe, invoking environmental limits, social fragmentation, or runaway innovation. Both positions share a flaw. They treat collapse as an event rather than a process. The ancient archive suggests a different framing. Collapse is not a single moment. It is a sequence of adjustments that exceed adaptive capacity. It unfolds unevenly, affecting different regions and populations at different times. It does not announce itself clearly. It reveals itself through strain, delayed responses, improvised solutions, and the gradual erosion of trust. Understanding collapse in this way changes the question. Instead of asking when collapse will occur, the more useful inquiry becomes how systems respond under sustained pressure. Do they adapt? Do they fragment? Do they centralize authority or distribute it? Do they preserve memory or suppress it? Ancient societies experimented with all of these responses. Some doubled down on hierarchy, consolidating power in the hope of restoring order. Others decentralized, allowing local systems to absorb shock. Some preserved detailed records of failure. Others erased them, preferring myth to memory. The outcomes varied. No strategy guaranteed survival. But patterns emerge. Systems that preserved memory tended to adapt more effectively. This does not mean they avoided collapse entirely. It means they recovered with less disorientation. Memory provided context. It allowed people to recognize familiar stages rather than interpreting each crisis as unprecedented. In contrast, societies that suppressed memory were often blindsided by predictable failures, repeating mistakes without recognizing them. In the modern context, memory takes many forms. Historical scholarship, data archives, cultural narratives. Yet memory is increasingly fragmented. Information is abundant, but coherence is scarce. The challenge is no longer preservation alone, but interpretation. Which memories matter? Which patterns are meaningful? Which warnings should guide action? Here the ancient restraint offers guidance. Sumerian scribes did not attempt to resolve every contradiction. They preserved complexity. They accepted uncertainty. Modern systems often do the opposite. They seek simplification, clarity, and definitive answers. This impulse is understandable but dangerous. Simplification accelerates decision-making at the cost of resilience. Resilience requires tolerance for ambiguity. It requires systems capable of adjusting without complete understanding. Ancient rituals served this function. They did not explain disaster. They structured response. Modern equivalents exist in contingency planning, redundancy, and decentralization. These are not expressions of pessimism. They are acknowledgments of reality. At the individual level, this perspective demands a shift in expectation. The promise of permanent stability must be relinquished. In its place emerges a different value: continuity through adaptation. Life is not secured by eliminating risk, but by cultivating responsiveness. This is not a call to resignation. Ancient texts do not celebrate collapse. They mourn it. But they also demonstrate that mourning and rebuilding are not mutually exclusive. One can acknowledge loss without surrendering agency. One can prepare without despair. As this continues, the focus will turn to responsibility. Not blame but responsibility in the deepest sense. Who maintains systems when authority is diffuse? How does one act ethically when outcomes are uncertain? What obligations persist when guarantees dissolve? The ancient world faced these questions without the illusion of progress. The modern world faces them with that illusion intact. Reconciling the two perspectives may be the central challenge of the present age. Responsibility becomes most visible when certainty disappears. In stable periods, ethical behavior often feels effortless because outcomes align predictably with intentions. Systems reward participation. Rules appear to work. In such validation to confirm that they were acting correctly. Obedience alone was insufficient. The question shifted from what is required to what is still mine to uphold? This question marks a decisive ethical transition. Responsibility is no longer imposed from above. It is assumed from within. Texts from late antiquity reveal this shift indirectly. They speak less about command and more about obligation. Not obligation enforced by punishment, but obligation sustained by recognition of interdependence. If the city fails, all suffer. If memory is lost, repetition follows. If vigilance collapses, disorder accelerates. Responsibility in this sense is not moral heroism. It is maintenance. Maintenance is rarely celebrated. It lacks the drama of conquest or reform. Yet it is the quiet force that preserves continuity when spectacle fails. The scribes who copied tablets long after their political relevance had faded were not shaping empires. They were sustaining coherence. Their work did not prevent collapse. It prevented amnesia. In the modern world, maintenance has become increasingly invisible. Infrastructure is expected to function silently. Expertise is taken for granted. Systems are noticed primarily when they break. This invisibility creates ethical distance. Responsibility feels abstract, distributed, diluted. Individuals assume someone else is accountable. Ancient societies recognized this danger intuitively. Diffuse responsibility was seen as a precursor to disorder. This does not mean ancient systems were more just. They were often rigid and exclusionary. But they understood that continuity requires ownership. Someone must hold the thread. When no one does, fragmentation accelerates. The challenge today is scale. Global systems are too large for any individual to comprehend fully, let alone maintain. This produces a sense of powerlessness that mirrors ancient fatalism, but without its ritual frameworks. People sense vulnerability but lack shared practices for responding to it. Anxiety becomes unstructured. Responsibility becomes performative rather than practical. Ancient responses offer limited guidance here, but one principle remains relevant. Responsibility is proportional to proximity. One is not accountable for everything. One is accountable for what one touches. Family, craft, community, knowledge. This localization of responsibility prevents paralysis. It allows action without illusion of control. In texts where collapse is acknowledged openly, ethical instruction narrows rather than expands. Do not abandon the vulnerable. Do not falsify memory. Do not exploit confusion. These are not ambitious demands. They are stabilizing ones. They do not promise restoration. They reduce harm. This reduction of harm becomes a moral priority in uncertain worlds. When improvement is uncertain, preventing deterioration becomes meaningful. This reframing preserves agency. It allows individuals to act ethically without requiring belief in inevitable success. Modern ethical systems often struggle with this stance. They are oriented toward optimization, progress, and resolution. Ancient ethics were oriented toward endurance. The goal was not to perfect the system but to keep it legible. To ensure that when conditions improved, recovery would be possible. Legibility is an underappreciated value. Systems collapse not only when they fail materially, but when they become unreadable. When people no longer understand rules, roles, or expectations, coordination dissolves. Ancient law codes, rituals, and narratives served to maintain legibility even under strain. They simplified not to deceive but to orient. In the present, legibility is threatened by complexity itself. Systems evolve faster than understanding. Decisions are made by processes few can explain. This produces mistrust. Ancient societies associated mistrust with divine withdrawal. Modern societies experience it as institutional opacity. The effect is similar. Engagement declines. Compliance becomes fragile. Restoring legibility does not require returning to ancient forms. It requires acknowledging limits, transparency, redundancy, education oriented toward understanding rather than efficiency. These are ethical choices as much as technical ones. The ancient world teaches that responsibility cannot be delegated indefinitely. At some point, individuals must decide whether to act as passive beneficiaries or active participants. This decision does not guarantee safety. It preserves dignity. As this second-to-last movement closes, a central insight emerges. Collapse does not negate responsibility. It clarifies it. When outcomes are uncertain, responsibility detaches from success and attaches to conduct. One acts not because action will prevail, but because inaction corrodes coherence. The final subpart will confront the hardest question of all. If collapse is possible, remembered, and ongoing, why continue building at all? Why invest, create, or hope? The ancient archive does not answer this directly, but it gestures toward an answer through persistence itself. The final question ancient memory leaves behind is not whether collapse can be avoided, but why continuity is pursued at all in the face of its inevitability. After witnessing cities erased, dynasties forgotten, and certainties dissolved, why did people continue to build, record, teach, and care? Why did they refuse to withdraw entirely from a world that had already proven itself fragile? The answer does not appear as doctrine or declaration. It appears as behavior. Again and again, across centuries of disruption, humans return to the same acts. They repair what can be repaired, they teach what can still be taught, and they preserve what they fear may be lost. These actions are not driven by optimism in the modern sense. They are driven by commitment. A commitment not to outcomes but to continuity of meaning. Ancient scribes knew that tablets would break, libraries would burn, and languages would die. Yet they wrote anyway. Builders knew that walls would crumble. Priests knew that rituals would fail to prevent disaster. Parents knew that children would inherit uncertainty rather than security. None of this stopped them. The act of continuation itself became the point. This reveals a profound truth about human resilience. It is not rooted in the belief that efforts will succeed, but in the refusal to let failure define what is worth doing. Collapse threatens structures, not values. When values remain intact, rebuilding remains possible, even if it takes generations. The ancient world understood that meaning is not extracted from permanence. It is generated through participation. To live meaningfully is not to escape vulnerability, but to engage with it deliberately. This is why collapse did not end civilization. It reshaped it. Each failure carried forward lessons that could not have been learned in stability. Modern society often interprets this persistence as denial. Why continue when systems are failing? Why invest in institutions that may not last? Why care when the future is uncertain? The ancient response is clear, though never stated outright. Because disengagement accelerates what it fears. Withdrawal. The final legacy of the ancient world is not fear of collapse, but familiarity with it. Collapse loses some of its terror when it is understood as part of human experience rather than its negation. This familiarity does not make collapse harmless. It makes it survivable. In the modern age, this lesson is easily overlooked. Progress has created distance from historical memory. Each generation assumes novelty. Each crisis feels unprecedented. Ancient texts disrupt this illusion. They remind us that humanity has always lived at the edge of uncertainty. What changes are the tools, not the condition. The persistence of storytelling itself is evidence of this lesson. Stories are carried forward not because they are accurate in every detail, but because they preserve orientation. They answer the question of how to live when answers are incomplete. They provide continuity when certainty is unavailable. This is why the ancient archive remains relevant. Not as warning, not as prophecy, but as companion. It does not tell us what will happen. It shows us how others endured not knowing. It demonstrates that dignity survives even when guarantees do not. At the end of the story, there is no resolution in the traditional sense. Collapse remains possible. Fragility remains real. Systems remain vulnerable. But something else remains as well. The human capacity to choose coherence over chaos, memory over amnesia, and participation over retreat. This choice does not eliminate risk. It defines identity. To build, to teach, to remember, and to care in a world that may fail is not naive. It is the most ancient form of courage. And so the story closes not with certainty but with continuity. Not with answers but with orientation. The ancient world does not offer reassurance. It offers recognition. You are not the first to live without guarantees. You will not be the last. What matters is not whether collapse comes, but whether meaning survives it. And as long as humans continue to remember, record, and rebuild, it does.